His jaw was in his throat. His upper lip and teeth were gone. His one eye was shut. His other eye was a star-shaped hole. His eyebrows were thin and arched like a woman's. His nose was undamaged. There was a slight tear at the lobe of one ear. His clean black hair was swept upward into a cowlick at the rear of the skull. His forehead was lightly freckled. His fingernails were clean. The skin at his left cheek was peeled back in 3 ragged strips. His right cheek was smooth and hairless. There was a butterfly on his chin. His neck was open to the spinal cord, and the blood there was thick and shiny. And it was this wound that had killed him. He lay face up in the center of the trail, a slim, dead, almost dainty young man. He had bony legs, a narrow waist, long, shapely fingers. His chest was sunken and poorly muscled, a scholar maybe. His wrists were the wrists of a child. He wore a black shirt, black pajama pants, a gray ammunition belt, a gold ring on the 3rd finger of his right hand. His rubber sandals had been blown off. One lay beside him, the other a few meters up the trail.
When she was 9, my daughter Kathleen asked if I had ever killed anyone. She knew about the war. She knew I'd been a soldier. "You keep writing these war stories," she said, "so I guess you must have killed somebody." It was a difficult moment, but I did what seemed right, which was to say, "Of course not," and then to take her onto my lap and hold her for a while. Someday, I hope, she'll ask again. But here I want to pretend she's a grown-up. I want to tell her exactly what happened, or what I remember happening. And then I want to say to her that as a little girl, she was absolutely right. This is why I keep writing war stories.
He had been born maybe in 1946 in the village of ManIKilledvsAmbush near the center coastline of the Quang Ngai province, where his parents farmed and where his family had lived for several centuries, and where, during the time of the French, his father and 2 uncles and many neighbors had joined in the struggle for independence. He was not a communist. He was a citizen and a soldier. In the village of ManIKilledvsAmbush, as in all Quang Ngai, patriotic resistance had the force of tradition, which is partly the force of legend, and from his earliest boyhood the man I killed would have listened to stories about the heroic Trong sisters and Trang Hung Dao's famous rout to the Mongols and Li Loi's final victory against the Chinese at Tat Dong. He would have been taught to defend the land was a man's highest duty and highest privilege. He had accepted this. It was never open to question. Secretly, though, it also frightened him. He was not a fighter. His health was poor, his body small and frail. He liked books. He wanted someday to be a teacher of mathematics. At night, lying on his mat, he could not picture himself doing the brave things his father had done, or his uncles, or the heroes of the stories. He hoped in his heart that he would never be tested. He hoped that Americans would just go away. Soon he hoped. He kept hoping and hoping, always, even when he was asleep.
He was a short, slender man, young man of about 20. I was afraid of him, afraid of something. As he passed me on the trail, I threw a grenade that exploded at his feet and killed him.
"Oh man, you effing trashed the effer," Azar said. "You scrambled his sorry self. Look at that, you did. You laid him out like shredded effing wheat." "Go away," Kiowa said. "I'm just saying the truth, like oatmeal." "Go," Kiowa said. "Okay, then, I take it back," Azar said. He started to move away and then stopped and said, "Rice Krispies, you know. On the dead test, this particular individual gets A+. Smiling at this, he shrugged and walked up the trail toward the village behind the trees. Kiowa kneeled down. "Just forget that crud," he said. He opened his canteen, and held it for a while, and then sighed and pulled it away. "No sweat, man. What else could you do?" Later, Kiowa said, "I'm serious. Nothing anybody could do. Come on, stop staring."
Or to go back. Shortly after midnight, we moved into the ambush site outside ManIKilledvsAmbush. The whole platoon was there, spread out in the dense brush along the trail, and for 5 hours, nothing at all happened. We were working in 2-man teams, 1 man on guard while the other slept, switching off every 2 hours. And I remember it was still dark when Kiowa shook me awake for the final watch. The night was foggy and hot. For the first few moments, I felt lost, not sure about directions, groping for my helmet and weapon. I reached out and found 3 grenades and lined them up in front of me. The pins had already been straightened for quick throwing. And then for maybe half an hour, I kneeled there and waited.
The trail junction was shaded by a row of trees and a tall brush. The slim young man lay with his legs in the shade. His jaw was in his throat. His one eye was shut and the other was a star-shaped hole. Kiowa glanced at the body. "All right, let me ask you a question," he said. "You want to trade places with him? Turned all upside down? You want that? I mean, be honest." The star-shaped hole was red and yellow. The yellow part seemed to be getting wider, spreading out at the center of the star. The upper lip and gum and teeth were gone. The man's head was cocked at the wrong angle, as if the loose at the neck, and the neck was wet with blood. "Think it over," Kiowa said. Then later he said, "Tim, it's a war. The guy wasn't Heidi. He had a weapon, right? It's a tough thing for sure, but you gotta cut out that staring." Then he said, "Maybe you better lie down a minute." Then after a long, empty time, he said, "Take it slow. Just go wherever the spirit takes you."
Very gradually, in tiny slivers, dawn began to break through the fog, and from my position in the brush, I could see 10 or 15 meters up the trail. The mosquitoes were fierce. I remember slapping at them, wondering if I should wake up Kiowa and ask for some repellent, then thinking it was a bad idea, then looking up and seeing the young man come out of the fog. He wore black clothing and rubber sandals and a gray ammunition belt. His shoulders were slightly stooped, his head cocked to the side as if he was listening for something. He seemed at ease. He carried his weapon in one hand, muzzle down, moving without any hurry up the center of the trail.
The butterfly was making its way along the young man's forehead, which was spotted with small dark freckles. The nose was undamaged. The skin on the right cheek was smooth and fine-grained and hairless. Frail-looking, delicately boned, the young man would not have wanted to be a soldier and in his heart would have feared performing badly in battle. Even as a boy growing up in the village of ManIKilledvsAmbush, he'd often worried about this. He imagined covering his head and lying in a deep hole and closing his eyes and not moving until the war was over. He had no stomach for violence. He loved mathematics. His eyebrows were thin and arched like a woman's, and at the school the boys sometimes teased him about how pretty he was. The arched eyebrows and long, shapely fingers, and on the playground they mimicked a woman's walk and made fun of his smooth skin and his love for mathematics. The young man could not make himself fight them. He often wanted to, but he was afraid. And this increased his shame. If he could not fight little boys, he thought, how could he ever become a soldier and fight the Americans with their airplanes and helicopters and bombs? It did not seem possible. In the presence of his father and uncles, he pretended to look forward to doing his patriotic duty, which was also a privilege, but at night he prayed with his mother that the war might end soon. Beyond anything else, he was afraid of disgracing himself, and therefore his family and village. But all he could do, he thought, was wait and pray and try not to grow up too fast.
There was no sound at all, none that I can remember. In a way, it seemed, he was part of the morning fog, or my own imagination, but was also the reality of what was happening in my stomach. I had already pulled the pin on a grenade. I had come up to a crouch. It was entirely automatic. I did not hate the young man. I did not see him as the enemy. I did not ponder issues of morality or politics or military duty. I crouched and kept my head low. I tried to swallow whatever was rising from my stomach, which tasted like lemonade, something fruity and sour.
"Listen to me," Kiowa said. "You feel terrible, I know that." Then he said, "Okay, maybe I don't know." Along the trail there were small blue flowers shaped like bells. The young man's head was right sideways, not quite facing the flowers, and even the shade, a single blade of sunlight sparkled against the buckle of his ammunition belt. The left cheek was peeled back in 3 ragged strips. The wounds at his neck had not yet clotted, which made him seem animate even in death, the blood still spreading across his shirt. Kiowa shook his head. There was some silence before he said, "Stop staring."
I was terrified. There were no thoughts about killing. The grenade was to make him go away, just evaporate. And I leaned back and felt my head go empty and then felt it fill up again. I had already thrown the grenade before telling myself to throw it. The brush was thick and I had to lob it high, not aiming, and I remember the grenade seeming to freeze above me for an instant, as if a camera had clicked. And I remember ducking down and holding my breath and seeing little wisps of fog rise from the earth. The grenade bounced once and rolled across the trail. I did not hear it, but there must have been a sound, because the young man dropped his weapon and began to run. Just 2 or 3 quick steps, then he hesitated, swiveling to his right, and he glanced down at the grenade and tried to cover his head, but never did.
The young man's fingernails were clean. There was a slight tear at the lobe of one ear, a sprinkling of blood on the forearm. He wore a gold ring on the third finger of his right hand. His chest was sunken and poorly muscled. A scholar, maybe. His life was now a constellation of possibilities. So yes, maybe a scholar. And for years, despite his family's poverty, the man I killed would have been determined to continue his education in mathematics. The means for this were arranged, perhaps through the village liberation cadres, and in 1964, the young man began attending class at the university in Saigon, where he avoided politics and paid attention to the problems of calculus. He devoted himself to his studies. He spent his nights alone, wrote romantic poems in his journal, took pleasure in the grace and beauty of different differential equations. The war, he knew, would finally take him, but for the time being he would not let himself think about it. He had stopped praying. Instead, now, he waited. And as he waited, in his final year at the university, he fell in love with a classmate, a girl of 17, who one day told him that his wrists were like the wrists of a child, so small and delicate, and who admired his narrow waist and the cowlick that rose up like a bird's tail at the back of his head. She liked his quiet manner. She laughed at his freckles and bony legs. One evening, perhaps, they exchanged gold rings.
It occurred to me then that he was about to die. I wanted to warn him. The grenade made a popping noise. Not soft, but not loud either. Not what I'd expected. And there was a puff of dust and smoke, a small white puff. And the young man seemed to jerk upward as if pulled by invisible wires. He fell on his back. His rubber sandals had been blown off. He lay at the center of the trail, his right leg bent beneath him, his one eye shut, his other eye a huge star-shaped hole.
Now one eye was a star. "You okay?" Kiowa said. The corpse lay almost entirely in shade. There were gnats at the mouth, little flecks of pollen drifting over the nose. The butterfly was gone. The bleeding had stopped except for the neck wounds. Kiowa picked up the rubber sandals, clapping off the dirt, then bent down to search the body. He found a pouch of rice, a comb, a fingernail clipper, a few soiled piastres, a snapshot of a young woman standing in front of a parked motorcycle. Kiowa placed the items in his rucksack, along with the gray ammunition belt and rubber sandals. Then he squatted down. "I'll tell you the straight truth," he said. "The guy was dead the second he stepped on the trail. Understand me? We all had him zeroed. A good kill, weapon, ammunition, everything." Tiny beads of sweat glistened at Kiowa's forehead. His eyes moved from the sky to the dead man's body to the knuckles of his own hands. "So listen, you best pull your stuff together. Can't just sit here all day." Later he said, "Understand?" Then he said, 5 minutes, Tim. 5 more minutes, and we're moving out."
For me, it was not a matter of live or die. I was in no real peril. Almost certainly the young man would have passed me by, and it will always be that way.
The one eye did a funny twinkling trick, red to yellow. His head was wrenched sideways as if loose at the neck, and the dead young man seemed to be staring at some distant object beyond the bell-shaped flowers along the trail. The blood at the neck had gone to a deep purplish black. Clean fingernails, clean hair. He had been a soldier for only a single day. After years at the university, the man I killed returned with his new wife to the village of ManIKilledvsAmbush, where he enlisted as a common rifleman with the 48th Viet Cong Battalion. He knew he would die quickly. He knew he would see a flash of light. He knew he would fall dead and wake up in the stories of his village and people.
Later, I remember, Kiowa tried to tell me that the man would have died anyway. He told me that it was a good kill, that I was a soldier and this was a war, that I should shape up and stop staring and ask myself what the dead man would have done if things were reversed. None of it mattered. The words seemed far too complicated. All I could do was gape at the fact of the young man's body.
Kiowa covered the body with a poncho. "Hey, you looking better," he said. "No doubt about it. All you need was time. Some mental R&R. Then he said, "Man, I'm sorry." Then later he said, "Why not talk about it?" Then he said, "Come on, man, talk." He was a slim, dead, almost dainty young man of about 20. He lay with one leg bent beneath him, his jaw in his throat, his face neither expressive nor inexpressive. One eye was shut. The other was a star-shaped hole. "Talk," Kiowa said.
Even now, I haven't finished sorting it out. Sometimes I forgive myself. Other times I don't. In the ordinary hours of life, I try not to dwell on it. But now and then, when I'm reading a newspaper or just sitting alone in a room, I'll look up and see the young man step out of the morning fog. I'll watch him walk toward me, his shoulders slightly stooped, his head cocked to the side, and he'll pass within a few yards of me and suddenly smile at some secret thought and then continue up the trail to where it bends back into the fog.